Welcome, everyone. My name is Representative Mary Hacken-Phillips of Hanover, and I'm delighted to see so many faces in the room tonight and on Zoom as well. And I have the pleasure of welcoming you all to the first Upper Valley Democrats event for 2026. So please note that this program is being recorded so that we can share it with other folks across the state. If you don't wish to be recorded, no problem. This is your chance now to go ahead and get it. Before we start, I'd like to just say a great many thanks to a few folks who helped me prepare for this event tonight. The Honorable Lori Harding, who had the idea and went the extra mile to make sure that we had a reserved space, organized our treats, and made sure that this event runs smoothly. So thank you, Lori. I also want to thank Grafton County Chair Ann Garland, who helped with our insurance policy and troubleshooting from a distance. She's away right now, so thank you to Ann. To Sarah Chamberlain, who's here helping us run the Zoom. Everybody wave. Thank you, Sarah. And a special thanks to the rest of the executive committee of the Upper Valley Democrats, who have each done something in their own way to support this event tonight. Next, I'd like to remind everyone that we are here and obligated to follow the rules of the Grafton County Democrats Rules for Public Events, which include two important rules that we'll keep in mind tonight. One, that the host, me, my decisions and rules will control the debate this evening and the discussion. And two, we will all treat each other with dignity and respect. So there will be no disruptions or personal attacks. And if there are some, we'll be politely asking you to leave. For those online, I want to remind everyone to please mute themselves during tonight's presentation, and there'll be a chance for you to unmute and ask a few questions a little later on. But please keep those mute buttons on to begin the event tonight. So thanks for keeping this event running smoothly, everybody. Now I just want to quickly lay out the format for tonight's event. First, we've invited Secretary Scanlan as New Hampshire's chief election official to give a 30-minute, give or take, presentation on recent election law changes in New Hampshire and how they pertain to voters here in the Upper Valley. I asked Secretary Scanlan to especially focus on how those changes might affect folks here in the Upper Valley, in particular seniors. And as we approach the election season, we know there's a lot of concerns about what may or may not have changed in election law. Second, we're going to have a little 15-minute Q&A section of the evening where we'll invite participants here in the room and online to submit their questions for the secretary. And I'll explain that kind of question and answer process a little later. Finally, we'll just make a couple of announcements and we'll have everybody out of here, hopefully on their way to celebrate Fat Tuesday or Chinese New Year or Ramadan, maybe even go home and see the Winter Olympics by about 7:30. Okay, let's get to work. Tonight, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce New Hampshire's 54th Secretary of State, David Scanlan, back to Grafton County. For those of you who are not aware, the Secretary has served as a New Hampshire State Representative for Canaan, the old Grafton County 11 seat, from 1984 to 2002. Wow. And by my count, that service is at least 4 lifetimes if you convert it to legislative years. So I really appreciate Mr. Secretary for service to our state. The Secretary also honorably served as New Hampshire's House Republican Majority Leader from 2000 to 2002, before becoming the Deputy Secretary of State to the Honorable Bill Gardner for more than 20 years. During the COVID-19 pandemic in early 2022, you may remember Secretary Bill Gardner resigned mid-term. And at that point, Secretary of Scanlan was kind of stepped into the role as the acting Secretary of State. But later that year in December, he was duly elected by the General Court to serve as the 54th, but technically 0.5, I guess, of the Secretary of State. And he's been serving in that role ever since. So here's a fun fact about the Secretary of State. Did you know that the Secretary of State is third in line of succession as acting governor, following the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House, when the governor is incapacitated or the office becomes vacant? So we have quite the political hierarchy here in the room this evening. Among the duties of the office, the Secretary oversees all of our state elections, including the creation of official ballots, administering recounts, and certifying the results before the Senate and House of Representatives in January following each biennial state election. So the Secretary's duties are the source and reason for our invitation to speak with us tonight. And on behalf of the Upper Valley Democrats, very pleased to welcome Secretary Scanlan to our February Voter Education and Information event here in the Upper Valley. Mr. Secretary, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Mary, for that introduction. Before I get started, I'm going to apologize in advance for the lingering effects of a cold that I have, and I'll do my best to get through it. There's a lot going on with elections right now, and when I first started in the job as Bill Gardner's deputy 25 years ago, the conduct of elections was ministerial. It was kind of this sleepy thing. Everybody trusted in the process and the results at the end of the day. And as long as you printed the ballots without mistakes and, the counts went all right in the individual polling places, everything was just safe. But in the interim, a lot has happened. And it started back in 2000 with a very close race for president. Very close. It was decided by the Supreme Court. And even with that, people questioned whether the outcome was correct or not. And you have to give Vice President Al Gore at the time, a lot of credit for just accepting the results as they were at that moment in time and walking away. But that's not the case today. And we have national leaders in both parties that make unfortunate statements about whether the person that won was a legitimate winner or not, or if the election was rigged. And we all hear that rhetoric almost on a daily basis now. And that's not helpful to how the average voter thinks about the process. And the big concern is if the average person in this country and in this state starts believing that there are issues or problems with the election process, they might start thinking, my vote really doesn't matter because things are so messed up. Why should I even bother to go to the polls? And we're seeing that, especially on a national level, where the confidence that voters have in the outcomes is dropping pretty dramatically. Not so much here in New Hampshire, but we are seeing a slight decline. And I just reassure everybody that New Hampshire has a really great election process. We are unique because the way we run elections is different than, than most other places around the country. For example, most of the states have to comply with the National Voter Registration Act, also known as Motor Voter. And what Motor Voter does is it makes the process of registering to vote easier in the sense that it can be done in many places. It's called Motor Voter because you can register to vote when you go to get your driver's license or register your motor vehicle. But in those states, other government agencies that have outreach to voters have the opportunity to register voters, have them fill out applications, and then turn them into a registration office. Or anybody, doesn't have to be an election official, anybody can walk down any main street with a stack of registration cards, have people fill them out, take the cards, and then turn them into a registration agency. But in that process, you can understand how people's names might get on the checklist twice. There are duplicate names on the checklist in many of those places. And so the process of cleaning up the voter lists is a little more challenging than it is in New Hampshire. In New Hampshire, a person that wants to register to vote has to fill out that registration with their own local election official. So if you're a new voter in Lebanon and you want to register to vote, you have to go to the city clerk's office to make that happen. There are limited instances where that registration can be done by absentee, but you have to have a reason. You either have to be absent or you have to have a disability that prevents you from getting to the polling place. The legislature has defined both of those processes a little more so that in the case of disability, for example, it would include a upcoming snowstorm that might prevent you from getting to the polls safely, especially if you're an elderly person and you're concerned about falling and maybe fracturing a hip. That's reason enough to be able to request a ballot by absentee, for example. And the law allows caretakers, whether it's a parent, a stay-at-home parent that has a bunch of small kids to watch, or somebody that's watching an infirm adult on a full-time basis, can also use those laws to request an absentee ballot. But the bottom line is, we know, or your local election officials know, who is registering to vote, and they can easily scrutinize the qualifications with that. Ms. Lori. So there have been some law changes over the last few years that have changed the way that people register to vote. If your name is already on the checklist, if you're already a voter in this state, you're really going to have no issues at all going to vote. You just show up at the polls. You have to show a photo ID, an acceptable form of ID to be able to get your ballot. But once you do that, you just proceed with the voting process like you always have. Excuse me, like you always have. If you are a voter in New Hampshire, and let's say you lived in Hanover and you moved to Lebanon, you have to register to vote in Lebanon. But because you are already entered into the statewide voter registration database as having been a voter, the only thing you have to prove in the new location is your identity, just so that the people registering, you know in fact who you are, and then domicile, showing the new address in the town that you want to register in. If you've been on the checklist in the past, you've already proven your citizenship and you've already proven your age, so you don't have to do that a second time. If you are a brand new voter, the law now requires that you have to bring in documentation to prove all of your qualifications. You can no longer use affidavits under the penalties of voter fraud to do that process. If you have to prove your identity, you have to prove your age, you have to prove your citizenship, and you have to prove your domicile. And there are presumptive documents that can be used to prove those qualifications that are automatically accepted if you present them. And they would be things like a New Hampshire driver's license, or actually any state's driver's license when you're doing it for the first time, because it's a governmental ID. That would prove identity. If it's a New Hampshire driver's license, it also might show your domicile. I don't know if driver's licenses show your age on them anymore or not, but
yeah.
And then the other forms are passport, certainly proves you're a citizen, birth certificate, naturalization papers if you've been a naturalized citizen. And then the law says any other reasonable documentation if you don't have any of the other documents to prove. The other thing that is important to remember is that you have to be able to show your name as it is currently, especially if you had a name change at some point along the way. Either you got married or you had a court, change your name to something that you like better than your old one. Sometimes married couples have hyphen names, or children might have hyphenated names. You have to be able to show documentation of the name change if it is not readily evident on one of the other forms of documentation that you provide. The law is pretty stiff in that regard, in terms of what's required. And so there was an additional law that was passed that gave my office the responsibility of trying to make it easier for voters that may not have those documents. And what that law included was having an agreement with the Division of Motor Vehicles in New Hampshire so that we can access their database looking for information that would help qualify a voter. For example, when voters go in to get a real ID, they have to show proof of citizenship to be able to do that. And so if a voter comes into a polling place and the polling place has access to the voter registration database, then your local election official will be able to enter the database, look up the information in DMV, and if they can find that you're a US citizen, then they'll be able to verify that, and the voter that may not have had that document will be able to continue with the process to vote. We're doing the same thing with the Division of Vital Records, which is a division which is in the Secretary of State's office. And Vital Records it collects information related to births and deaths and marriages. So we can look up birth certificates for people that were born in New Hampshire. We can look up marriage certificates that would help prove a name change. And that database will also be accessible to election officials at the polling place. The person that is requesting that information of the election official has to have a direct and tangible interest in that data. So we're happy to give you information on yourself to help you prove those qualifications. But if your next door neighbor comes in to get the information for you, that won't happen because that person does not have a direct and tangible interest in your private information. Another family member would. So the other thing that we're going to do is, and we have been doing this through social media, and other messaging, is just encourage voters that if they have to register to vote, try not to wait until election day to do it. Get that process moving ahead of time so that you're not stuck on the day of election having to prove your documents. So that is probably a good place for me to stop on that part and just ask if there's any questions about any of that. Way back.
I'm interested in, you mentioned how they can look into DMV records or vital
That's
documents.
right.
Sorry. Is it already possible, if someone wants to register to vote, is it already possible for them to use the DMV records approach, or is that coming in the future?
It is, I believe it is available right now. And the process with vital records is that if a voter, a potential voter, wants their actual document to take to the election official to get registered, then that document will be given to that individual free of any other charges that would otherwise be charged. But the document will have a statement on it, can only be used for voting purposes only. Yes.
Well, a couple questions, but based on what you just said, if a voter wants to get a document from Vital Records, where do they have to go to present whatever they need to present and to get that document? And does it also mean that a family person could do it? So for my 80-year-old, 100-year-old mother, can I do it for them?
So the question was, where do you go to get the information from Vital Records? And the answer to that is you can go to your town clerk, okay, or you can go to Vital Records in Concord. And if you want to get one for your 100-year-old mother, because you're the daughter, you have a direct and tangible interest in that record. And so what you would be required to prove your identity, you would have to fill out some personal information on the person for which you're trying to get the record. so that they can use that to locate the record and then get you an appropriate copy.
Personal information like that person's social security number or their date of birth or how detailed?
It would be more, because it's a vital record, it would be more along the lines of personal data, relationships, gender, all of those items. I don't know if we have a copy, I don't know if we have a copy of the form, but, we can make that available, and you can see it.
I feel like New Hampshire had a really good, safe system of voting. You've been doing a really good job. Fraud was like, really not. And yet the laws that have been passed feel much more exclusionary than inclusive in terms of the ability to vote and who do we want to have vote. How hard are we gonna make it for people who might have issues to vote? Do you as Secretary of State have an opinion on what the accessibility of voting should be in New Hampshire?
That's a political question. And I would answer it this
You
way.
didn't say who you vote for. It's not.
I'm just asking you.
Well, yeah, so the legislature makes the policy in the state. And there is a tension that exists between making it easy for people to vote and exercise that right against making sure that the people that are participating are qualified, where you have to, require people show documentation, whatever. So wasn't that long ago, maybe a decade ago, anybody could walk into a polling place without any documentation at all. And simply by signing an affidavit, I'd swear under the penalties of voter fraud that everything I'm telling you is true, give me my ballot and let me vote.
Right.
And a lot of people believe that, that's a good way to do it. But there are other people out there that say, wait a minute, how do I know that person's qualified? And I'm just taking their word for it. If I walked into a bank and asked the teller to give me $100, I'll pay it back tomorrow, just hand it over.
But the affidavit is meaningful, isn't it?
Well, the affidavit, if that person can be found, and it turned out that they lied, would be guilty of a crime.
But also, weren't those provisional? So if you did it by affidavit, those were held as provisional.
Until
only you,
yeah.
it was a close vote.
No, they were not provisional. I mean, there was a couple of years ago, there was a law that was in place that did just that, but that was short-lived. I'm talking before that, there was no provisional anything. And so now, the ideology of the legislature has shifted, the power has shifted.
Yeah.
And so the legislature has said, forget about the affidavits, we want everybody to prove that they're qualified. That is a new register. And anybody that has been on the checklist in the past, that's being taken at face value. So the trick is, because this is a partisan discussion in the legislature, and you have one side that says it should be this way, and the other side says it should be that way. The worst thing from my perspective as an administrator of the election process is that every time there's a power shift, that rope just gets pulled hard in one direction, and 2 or 4 years later, it gets yanked back the other way. That's not good for anybody. Ideally, people should be trying to find out where that sweet spot is between having it easy to vote, but having confidence that people are qualified, and try and stick to that. And that's something that I'm working towards, and hopefully at some point we'll get there. But right now, we just, the tendency is to kind of do this.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that, there's some election officials in the room and they know exactly what I'm talking about is, it is not helpful. In fact, it is chaotic if the voters just lose track of what the process is, right? And the best thing to build confidence is to be more transparent in the process. And as election officials, we have to do a better job of educating the voters when they're moving through the polling place, because there are a bunch of checks and balances that are in full view in the polling place when people are actually voting, but they don't know it. That has to be pointed out to them. And the examples of that are the ballot clerks that are handing out the ballots. It should be a Republican sitting next to a Democrat that is appointed by the political parties that are, handing it out and crossing names off, and they're keeping track of each other. And the parties get to have official challengers at the check-in table. They get a special position there so that they can see and hear who is going through. In most cases, they're keeping track to make sure that their supportive voters are going through the process. But if they see a voter that they don't think is qualified, then they can challenge that person. What we know from history is that there are voters that engage in that process in an inappropriate way. And every year we catch 2 or 3 or 4 of them and they get prosecuted. But we don't see any widespread evidence that, there's a problem out there, and it certainly isn't organized. But it's the perceptions of what people have about the process, and if they believe a certain way, then you have to take steps to deal with that.
Mr. Secretary, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just want to make sure everybody knows, that we've given him 30 minutes to kind of give us the full presentation, and then we would move into Q&A after that. We kind of led into it, which is fine, very natural, discourse, and I appreciate that discussion, but we do want to set some ground rules for asking questions, moving forward. So first, I would just like to say, if you could please raise your hand to be recognized before you, speak, and that includes for folks online as well. And then we want to make sure that everybody has a chance to ask one question before asking a second question. And I would just really appreciate it if we could avoid like kind of a discourse debate, give and take. You get like a question, not like 5 follow-ups. So we just want to make sure that everybody has shared space equally and that we're all treating each other with respect. And Sarah, thank you for helping me monitor the online questions, which I know are coming. Before we move to the full Q&A section, Secretary Scanlan, I want to make sure you've had a chance to cover all the information that you had hoped to cover before that.
I have covered, I think, the important stuff for now. I am happy to talk about anything that this group wants to talk about. There are some neat things. We're celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and New Hampshire had a really important role in that process because on January 5th, we celebrated the 250th anniversary of the first constitution in the country for the colony of New Hampshire. And at the same time, it was a Declaration of Independence from Great Britain. And we have that manuscript. Thank you. We had that manuscript that was just recently restored in Concord. We've been putting it on display. So if you have an opportunity to see that, it's really neat.
I can attest, it is cool.
Question on that?
I'm sorry, where in Concord is it?
So currently,
Where in Concord?
it's in the state archives at the moment. And we had it on display in the State House for the month of January. It is really neat. In addition to that, we found in the archives the waistcoat of Josiah Bartlett, who was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And so we had that on display.
Very fancy. It's got this beautiful embroidery all over it. It's really pretty. So if you have a chance to see it, it's really quite touching.
Yeah. That document, because it was first, was interesting because when the royal governor of New Hampshire feared for his safety after we had the Pine Tree riot and the sacking of Fort William and Mary, where a bunch of patriots went down, removed the munitions from the fort, and then used them later at the Battle of Bunker Hill. all things in New Hampshire that took place, you know, before things really got going. When the royal governor left, the towns and the colony asked the Continental Congress, what should we do? We have no government, we have no court system. They said, well, make your own government. And so that's what they did. And when they did it, they put a comment in there that said, you know, hopefully we can reconcile with Great Britain. And when that happens, you know, things will get back to normal, which never did occur. So 8 years later, a more formal constitution was passed. And that created a government because of the distrust of the royal government. Government spread the power of government as broadly across the population as it could. So that's why we have a 400-member House of Representatives, and we have a governor that has to get 5 counselors to agree with any decisions that the governor makes. And that's what stood the test of time. You had a question?
There is one online I want to hit before we take another question from the room. So the first question is from Sandy Steele, and Sandy asked, if the SAVE Act passes in Congress, how will it affect election law here in New Hampshire?
So let me answer that very broadly, because there's a lot going on at the federal level related to elections. And the first thing that we saw was a request of all of the states, including New Hampshire, for all of the information in our voter registration database. And New Hampshire was one of the states that had that request made of it very early on in the process. And in New Hampshire, when the voter registration database was created under the Help America Vote Act in 2002, the legislators at the time said, we're going to have, you know, the public information on the checklist is going to be public, and that's the voter's name, party affiliation, and address, both mailing and physical address, and voter history, but everything else is private and confidential. And they had strict penalties in there, and strict provisions on who the Secretary of State is able to give that data to. And basically, confidential information is confidential. I could give it to the courts for help in creating their jury pool, their jury list. It can be given to the Attorney General's office in the case of investigations. I'm restricted on statewide public checklist that I can give out, and that's limited to political parties, political committees that are registered in New Hampshire, and candidates that are running for political office. And in each of those cases, those entities have to pay for the list, which I think is, right now it's around $8,500, something like that. If I give the list out beyond that, then I am committing a crime. And so when the federal government approached me in the first instance, I said to them, I can't give you the list. I've got a state law that says I can't. And in addition to that, elections are the purview of the states, not the federal government. And so they responded with a letter that said, that cited a bunch of federal laws that they said were applicable and compelled me to give the list. And when I had the attorneys in my office review those citations, there was nothing in there that I could see that superseded the New Hampshire statute. And so that's where we're at. They have since sued me in federal court, and we filed a motion to dismiss. I think it's a really strong motion, and we'll see what the judge does with that. Then there have been some alarming statements that have come out of the White House administration about nationalizing elections and taking over certain parts of that. again, you know, the conduct of elections is left to the states. That's in the federal constitution. Congress can have a say over some of it, but the executive does not. So there's a phone call next Thursday, not 2 days from now, but a week from Thursday, with the FBI and some other federal agencies. That is not an unusual thing for me. There have been federal agencies that have put on, you know, Zoom calls and things in the past. What I found out most of the time is that you don't learn anything from those sessions that you didn't already read in the press. And I'm guessing that's probably gonna be what happens next Thursday. But if it is something different, and if it's something alarming, I will be transparent and people of New Hampshire about what happens, and then as we follow the developments that somebody mentioned, the Save American Act, I mean, that's kind of moving through the process. My read of it is that it doesn't do much that New Hampshire doesn't already do, so I don't think it would be, you know, I don't think it would be a shock to New Hampshire if it passed, but I don't know how close it is to getting through the process anyway. So I'm not gonna be worrying about things like that until the picture becomes a lot more clear than it is at the moment. Regardless of all of that, New Hampshire has a long history of being prepared for whatever is thrown at us during the election process. And the pandemic is a great example of that. New Hampshire did an outstanding job managing that, you know, with, you know, everybody learned how to use Zoom and, you know, communicate that way. Election officials were very attentive, very participatory. The guidance that we gave out was sound and it was followed. And we had very few issues with that election. So, whatever happens, we'll be ready for it.
One more question from online. This came from Sue Leibowitz. What happens with new registrations for out-of-state documents like name changes and birth certificate? Are only certified documents accepted?
Out-of-state documents will be accepted. If they're certified, that certainly helps lend value to it, but if they are not, and the election official that is receiving the documentation believes that it's more likely than not that that is a legitimate document, then it would be accepted. We've also given guidance that if a new voter has a document on their cell phone, for example, and they can pull it up and show that to the election official, that will also be satisfactory.
Thank you. Let's go back to your questions here in the room. I think there was one in the back that I was.
Thank you. Yeah, Rob Green from here in Lebanon.
Thank you.
So first of all, Secretary Scanlan, thank you for pushing back the Department of Justice and your continuing work to keep the election based here in the state of New Hampshire. During your presentation, you mentioned an interesting fact. I think you said that something like a couple times a year, 2 or 4 times, you come across people who have tried to register inappropriately and take care of it. And that sounds to me like none of them even get through. And you mentioned that there's a tension in the state between the people, the legislature, the people who believe that voter fraud is a big issue and people who don't. It seems to me that this fact weighs a lot stronger than what people believe, and I hope the legislature makes decisions based on facts. So my question is, have you spoken with the legislature about the lack of voter fraud that you are seeing as Secretary of State, and how much, you know, how little there appears to be, and why they need to make laws that don't unnecessarily restrict voting, in my opinion? Thank you.
So the answer is yes. I mean, I have given the same presentation to the legislature that I had given to you here tonight, and said the same things. Social media is a real challenge in, you know, in today's atmosphere, and, you know, it does not honor political boundaries. So, you know, what happens in another state is readily viewed here in New Hampshire by anybody that watches. And people get their news in different ways. News is not what it used to be. You know, most of it today is opinion-based as opposed to objectively presented like it was 30 or 40 years ago. And people tend to listen to news sources that kind of fall in line with the beliefs that they have. And even with the facts that are presented, and even with steps that are taken to address concerns, people still have these really strong beliefs that things are certain
We're talking
ways.
about the legislature, the Free Staters, the Republicans in the legislature. We're not talking about people, we're talking about the legislature.
Well, the legislature are people. I mean, they get elected from all of our communities. And many of them hold these beliefs that I'm talking about. And we are faced with a lot of legislation that borders on micromanagement. You know, a lot of issues related to chain of custody, and, you know, some people want watermarked paper on the ballots, and by themselves, they all might be good ideas, but when you take a step back and you try and look at the big picture of how our elections are run, and the way in New Hampshire where all of the election officials are elected locally or pulled in from the community to help run it, people should have faith in that process, because it's, you know, it is human, and there are mistakes that are made because of that. And unfortunately, people wave those mistakes around like it was some type of fraudulent act, but those are exactly the things why people should have confidence in the election process.
Thank you.
I wanted to just, before we move to the next question, ask, I know there's a couple of town clerk representatives here tonight. If you could just like give a little wave so Secretary Scanlan sees you. Excellent.
They're ready to answer questions.
Yeah, so thank you so much for coming. I wanted to make sure that I give you all a chance if you had a specific question to ask before we move to everybody else. Okay. Oh, Laurie, please.
I just have a curious, weird one. And in a year where there's a presidential primary early in the year, and then the state primary, and then the general election, what is the state budget for those elections, for the election year? I'm just curious about how much money the state has to spend to put on those three big elections.
I don't know the answer to that question, but I'm guessing that it's probably in the range of $1 million. You know, for that election cycle.
Yeah.
We have, the legislature does give us plenty of resources to do elections, so, you know, I feel like we have ample funds to prepare the ballots and get them distributed. And, we do have money left over from the Help America Vote Act. When that was created in 2002, we received, it was around $17 million. And we've received significant money since then. Usually when the pandemic was here, we got $3 million to help with that. There have been concerns about cybersecurity, and so we've gotten funding for that. But when the program started, we spent the money we needed to spend to meet the requirements, and then we put the rest of the money, the principal, into the election fund. And the legislature said you can only spend a certain percentage of that every year. The idea being that the money, the interest that was earned would be used to pay for the ongoing mandates, all of the election training that we do, upgrades to the voter registration database. We're now rolling out accessible voting equipment for the town elections. We're scrambling to get that done. That's all paid for with Help America Vote Act money. And then in addition to that, we are changing over to new ballot counting devices that use newer technology. And we did a cost share program with all of the cities and towns in New Hampshire to help cover the cost of those devices. And then, we're also, doing some cost sharing to help towns get set up with electronic poll books to make that process more efficient. I don't know if Lebanon is doing that yet or not, but that certainly helps.
Lebanon's using poll pass.
Okay, we have kind of reached our program, period, but I know there are still questions in the room, so I'll extend it by another 5 minutes, if that's okay with everyone. And I'll take another couple of questions. Right up front, Kim?
Thank you for coming and for the presentation. I apologize, I was late, so if this was already answered, ignore it. Two short questions. One is, are there enough people? And is there something that your state can do to supplement those cities and towns that may not have enough people? And the second question, and you may have already answered this, is what is the impact of the changes in the postal service laws going to be on New Hampshire voting,
Yeah.
absentee and?
If you could kind of summarize the question, because I know people online might have had a hard time hearing.
So the question is, are there enough poll workers to help in the communities around the state with the conduct of elections? And then the second question is, how is the post office doing, in terms of delivering ballots and things like that? Doing the post office first. Unfortunately, I don't think we can rely on the post office anymore to get mail ballots in a day or two. So anybody that is planning on voting by absentee, I would suggest that depending where you are, you make sure that you give plenty of time for that ballot to get to where it needs to go. In terms of poll workers, communities in New Hampshire do a pretty good job recruiting the people that are needed. It's done on a very local level. Some communities do struggle though, getting people to participate. And so part of the efforts that I'm doing in my office is, well, when I became Secretary of State, I did two things. One was hire a communications director to help with all the messaging that we need to get out there and keep track of what's going on in the news. And then the second thing was hiring a voter education and civics outreach coordinator. That's Lily sitting in the back. And that effort has included reaching out to all of the voting constituencies that we have in the state, seniors, new Americans, veterans, individuals with disabilities, students. We're hitting all of those groups hard. And we have some brochures here. I think these are specific to seniors on the laws related to registering to vote. But we do these for new Americans. We have one for students. We publish them in different languages so that, new Americans have an opportunity to, be able to easily read that stuff. And part of that process, especially with veterans, is encouraging them to think about serving their country again in the form of being a poll worker. And we've had some success with that. We're partnered with a national group called Bet the Vote, and they in turn partner with the NFL. We had some Patriots helping at an event, and at the NASCAR track, there was a big event there. And so we're doing a lot of outreach to help with poll worker issue.
So I think we have, the microphone might be working. Sorry if it's very loud. Another question, so I'm gonna try the microphone because the air system just turned on and it got a little noisy. So we're gonna try to use the microphone, and I just hold it maybe 6 to 8 inches away from your face.
How's this? Anything?
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you, by the way. Harrison Drinkwater, and I wondered if you could go over any changes in procedures for absentee ballots. And I'm thinking of senior friends who may have moved, may have had a death of their spouse. And so all of the key indicators that we need to prove, age, identity, citizenship, and domicile, those documents could be somewhere yet to be discovered in their new household. I'm just wondering, where do you see absentee ballots in this new world? Thank you.
The absentee ballots are really follow the same rules as the official ballot. It's just being done remotely. So if a person is already on the checklist, even if they lived in a different town before, they're pretty much all set. They have to send, you know, a photo of a driver's license or something to prove their identity. And if they moved, they would have to show, that they changed the domicile. If it's a new voter that has to register by absentee, they have to provide the documentation with the application. There is a lot that is occurring with absentee ballots, especially when it comes to individuals that have disabilities. Individuals that might have, you know, a sight disability can now receive their absentee ballot online, just like a member of the military that might be serving overseas. They can fill that ballot out using some third-party software, and then they can mail it back to the clerk. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. The requirements are the same.
And we have a question over here.
Thank you very much. What kind of obstacles are Dartmouth students gonna have in terms of registering to vote?
They should not have obstacles. The law gives college students a choice. They can vote from the community that they came from before they went to college. And that's most likely by absentee unless they go back to wherever that place was to vote. Or the law says that they can claim the community that they are living in while they're going to school as their domicile. The Supreme Court has issued an opinion, it's been a few years now, saying that domicile and residency are basically the same thing. So by claiming domicile in the community that a student is living in while they're going to school is the same as claiming residency in that community. Now, I don't think Dartmouth may not make a distinction between in-state and out-of-state, but in UNH, I don't think a student claiming domicile or residence in Durham is going to affect the impact of whether they're paying out-of-state tuition or not. It might over time. But what it means basically is that, you know, if a student from Missouri going to Dartmouth registers to vote at Dartmouth, and they're going to drive a vehicle in New Hampshire, then they should be getting a driver's license.
But what if they're not getting?
If they're not driving a car, then they don't have to. Now, enforcement of that is an issue, because that's not an election law, it's a motor vehicle law. But when they say that they are a resident, they are saying that they adhere to the laws of New Hampshire that apply to residents.
There's a quick, easy question online that I think we could get your opinion on. Noel Barstow asks, what is voter history?
Voter history is a record of when a voter voted in the past. Which is public information. Every time you go to vote, your name is marked off on the checklist as having received the ballot and voted. And that's a public document that has to be kept. So voter history is in what election you voted. In the case of a primary, it would tell which party's ballot you took, but it does not in any way indicate how you voted ballot.
Thank you. I think that's helpful for the folks at home.
Thank you so much for being here. My takeaway from what you said is that we as a community need to do some really good education among those people that may be new in our community, but also among students. And I do have a follow-up question to Don's question about students. So if a student wants to vote, they live in Lebanon, they go to Dartmouth, they're going to be here for 4 years, then they need to come prepared with a they need to compare with a birth certificate or a passport, which means that Dartmouth, to some degree, needs to help get the word out to students. If you want to vote here, you need to come and bring those things with you, because it's not something they can do last minute, the week of the election. And then in addition to that, people need to be able to prove residency. So what can a Dartmouth student use to prove that they live in Lebanon? We used to be able to say, bring a bill, an oil bill, an electricity bill. Is that still legitimate?
That is still true. The law has some presumptive documentation that it lists. And it says that if you don't have any of those documents, you can sign an attestation that says you don't have those documents, and then that allows you to bring in a number of other things, like a utility bill, a lease agreement.
To prove residency.
Yes,
Jackie, David, do you want me to
I
grab
just
that?
make sure,
I was gonna answer more.
okay, yeah, Tracy, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Tracy Walsh from the town clerk in Hanover, so I probably know the most about these questions, other than my deputy Bobby. For students in Lebanon, we do have ways to work with them. Students, and a lot of this education is happening, we can always do more. Sometimes we do have students obviously come to the Hanover Town Hall because they go to Dartmouth. We educate them that you actually live in Lebanon if you live at Sachem or you're living at Summit on Jupiter. They can get a letter from the college which will prove their domicile, which I'm fairly certain the city clerk would accept in the same way that we accept it. We also sometimes work with their portals. We try to make it easy. I will say, as David alluded to, electronic forms of your documentation can be sufficient. You'd be surprised if you polled a Dartmouth student and said, do you have your passport on your phone? 95% of them will have it immediately on their phone available. And in that way, we're really able to expedite the registration process. Yeah, and we will suggest with some of the education for new students and such, just it is helpful if you have you come to town hall or if you're going to the polls to keep the lines moving along as fast as we possibly can.
Can I just ask a question on that?
Sure.
So the real ID, real ID will say I'm a citizen, right? That's the.
No. If I can do this. No, real ID is there's little conflating. The real ID is a proof of your age, your identity, sometimes your domicile, if it's you do bring all that documentation to get the real ID, but your driver's license doesn't actually prove it. But we have ways that we can find it, but.
Are there any other first questions in the room from folks who have not had a chance to ask a question? And it's Tom Corman.
So the voter rolls are swept every now and then because people have not voted for a while. So if a voter's name is swept off the voter rolls and then they want to re-register, are they really starting from scratch or?
that was happening just before, and their information is still there. The only thing they would have to prove is their identity and their domicile.
All right, well, thank you for everybody for participating. I think it's been some really great informative discussion, and I just encourage you to stick around and grab a treat. Say hello to Secretary Scanlan on your way out, and we'll see you at future events. Thank you so much.
Question.